I've been putting off writing this for a long time. Part of me still thinks that if I don't put it into words, it never really happened the way I remember it. But it did. So here goes. My name's William, and this is something I've never told anyone in full detail. Not friends, not family. Not even the version of myself I try to be now. It started with something I didn't fully understand at the time, a set of secret compromising material. That's the only way I can describe it without going too deep too fast. It wasn't supposed to end up in my hands. It wasn't supposed to exist in my orbit at all. Back then, I was already in a rough place. Not broke in the dramatic sense, but drifting. Job I didn't care about, sleep schedule wrecked, and a constant feeling that everyone else had some kind of manual for life that I never got. The opportunity, if you can even call it that, came through someone I barely trusted but still kept around. That's on me. I won't pretend otherwise. There was talk, vague at first, about information that could change outcomes, shift leverage. That kind of language people use when they're trying to make something shady sound neutral. I didn't say yes immediately. I told myself I was just listening. Observing. Staying detached. That's the lie I told myself most often back then. The truth is, something about it stuck in my head. Not the details, not yet, but the idea that information could be power in a very direct, very uncomfortable way. And that once you've seen that door, you can't really pretend it's not there anymore. I didn't act right away. But I also didn't walk away. And that's where this really begins. In the next part, I'll talk about how I justified even staying close to it. Because that was the first real decision that mattered more than I wanted to admit. After that first conversation, I kept telling myself I was just staying informed. That was the phrase I used. It sounded harmless enough that I could repeat it without feeling like I was lying. But I was lying. The truth is, I started rearranging my morals in small, quiet steps. Not all at once, that would have been too obvious, even to me. It was more like I kept lowering the bar and pretending it was still the same ground. I remember thinking, if this material exists, someone will use it anyway. If not me, then someone worse. That's the kind of logic that feels clever at 2 a.m. and completely hollow in daylight. I stayed in contact with him, the guy who first mentioned it. We didn't speak directly about the file, most of the time. It was hints, coded language, half-sentences that meant more than they should have. And slowly, without ever explicitly agreeing to anything, I stopped resisting the idea of being involved. I didn't see it as a decision anymore. I saw it as momentum. And momentum, I told myself, is something you just ride until it stops. I didn't think it would be real. That's the part one remember most clearly, the expectation that it would turn out to be exaggerated, or fake, or something I could dismiss easily once I saw it with my own eyes. But it wasn't. When I was finally shown the material, it felt less like information, and more like something physical sitting in my chest. I won't describe what it contained, because even now I don't want to pin it down too precisely. It's not about the specifics. It's about the realization that it had weight, consequences attached to it, like invisible chains. The guy who had it acted like it was normal. Like this kind of thing passed through hands all the time, and only mattered depending on who was holding it. I didn't respond the way I expected. No shock, no outrage. Just a strange quiet focus. That worried me more than anything. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't looking away. I was studying it. And that meant I was already involved, whether I admitted it or not. After I saw it, I told myself I still had time to step back. That I hadn't done anything yet, so nothing had really changed. But that wasn't true either, because my thinking had already shifted. The next few days, I started treating everything like a problem I could solve. Not morally. Practically. That was the trick I used on myself. If you turn something into logistics, you don't have to sit with what it actually means. I started asking questions I pretended were casual. Who had access? How it was stored? What kind of oversight existed? Small details, gathered piece by piece. He noticed I was getting more engaged. I could tell. There was a kind of satisfaction in his tone when he spoke to me, like he'd seen this happen before. I didn't have a full plan. Not even close. But I had something worse, direction without boundaries. And I remember thinking, very clearly, that I could still stop whenever I wanted. That sentence felt like control. Now I see it was just the beginning of losing it. I wish I could point to a single moment where I made the decision, like a switch flipping. It wasn't like that. It was more like I stopped noticing where the line was. There was a point where I was no longer just asking questions. I was actively involved in shaping how things would move forward, even if I still told myself I was only observing. That's how I justified it, observation. Not participation. We met again, this time with more specifics. Real details were discussed, though still wrapped in vague language. I remember the setting more than the content: dim lighting, cheap coffee gone cold, my phone face down on the table like it was guilty of something. He laid out possibilities. Not instructions, never direct instructions. Just paths. Options. Outcomes framed like a menu. And I picked one. Not verbally, not officially. But in the way I didn't object when I should have. That's what I can't shake. It wasn't violence or chaos that marked the turning point. It was silence. My silence. After that meeting, I stopped pretending I was separate from it. I just didn't say it out loud yet. Once I stopped pretending I was separate from it, things started moving faster than I expected. It's strange how quickly planning turns into doing when you stop questioning each step. I began handling small tasks, nothing that felt dramatic on its own. Just pieces. Transfers of responsibility. Quiet coordination. Things that, individually, looked meaningless, but together formed something I didn't want to name. I kept telling myself I was still in control because I was careful. That was my favorite justification: careful people don't get caught, therefore careful people are right. We had another meeting where everything felt more structured. Less theory, more execution. The tone had shifted too, less exploratory, more certain. That bothered me more than anything else, but I didn't stop it. There were moments where I almost spoke up, almost said I was out. But each time, I found a reason to wait one more day. That's how it happened, really. Not one big decision. Just a chain of postponed exits. And by the time I realized I was deep in it, I was already responsible for parts of it working. I still replay that night more often than I want to admit. Not because it was loud or cinematic, it wasn't. It was almost disappointingly normal on the surface, which is what makes it stick in my head. Everything had been arranged in advance. Timing, access, the sequence of actions. I remember checking my phone repeatedly, not because I was waiting for instructions, but because I was waiting for permission I never actually needed. At some point, I realized no one was going to stop me. That sounds obvious now, but in the moment it felt like standing at the edge of something and realizing the edge doesn't push back. Things unfolded in a steady rhythm. There were minor complications, small delays, unexpected gaps in timing, but nothing that broke the flow. If anything, that made it worse. It proved how easily it all held together. I didn't feel heroic or powerful. I felt detached, like I was watching myself from a slight distance, following steps I had already rehearsed too many times in my head. When it was done, there was no celebration. Just silence. And the sudden awareness that nothing would be, after this anymore. What surprised me most wasn't fear. It was the lack of it. I expected adrenaline, shaking hands, maybe even panic once it was over. Instead, there was just this flat, delayed sensation, like my brain hadn't caught up to what my body had already gone through. We didn't talk much afterward. There wasn't anything to say that didn't sound absurd out loud. He gave a few short remarks, practical things, almost businesslike. I nodded along, even though I wasn't really processing them. When I finally got home, I remember standing in my hallway for a long time without turning on the lights. I didn't want to arrive back into normal life too quickly, like it would force me to acknowledge the gap between what I'd done and what I was supposed to be. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Not because I felt guilty yet, that came later, but because my mind kept replaying the same question in different forms. Was that really it? It felt too simple for something I already knew would change everything. The first few days afterward, I tried to act normal. That was the word I kept using in my head, normal. Like it was a setting I could switch back on if I behaved convincingly enough. But everything felt slightly off. People at work didn't notice anything, or if they did, they didn't show it. That almost made it worse. I kept expecting someone to look at me differently, to ask a question I couldn't answer without falling apart. Instead, life just kept going. I started noticing small details I normally ignore, how often people laughed without meaning it, how conversations repeated themselves, how fragile routines actually are when you're paying attention. At night, though, it caught up with me. Not in the form of panic, exactly. More like delayed awareness. My thoughts would drift back to specific moments, and suddenly I'd feel like I was standing inside them again. I stopped telling myself I was fine. I just started telling myself I was still undiscovered. And I wasn't sure which one was worse. It didn't hit me all at once. It crept in through small habits I didn't realize I was forming. I started double-checking things I never used to think about. Not because anything had changed externally, but because my mind had. Every notification on my phone felt slightly loaded, like it might contain something that would unravel everything. I began hesitating before answering calls, letting them ring out longer than necessary just to give myself a second to compose whatever version of me was safe to present. At work, I became overly precise, over-explaining simple things, smiling at the wrong times, then overcorrecting by becoming too quiet. It felt like I was constantly adjusting a mask that no longer fit properly. I also started imagining conversations that hadn't happened yet, questions I might be asked, ways things could be connected back to me, even when there was no evidence anyone was looking. The worst part was that I couldn't tell if I was being careful or just afraid. And slowly, those two things started to feel exactly the same. It wasn't law enforcement, or some dramatic confrontation that made things unstable. It was trust. Or more accurately, the lack of it between people who were supposed to be on the same side. He started becoming harder to read. Shorter answers. Delayed replies. Meetings that used to feel structured became loose, like he was mentally somewhere else. I noticed it before I admitted it to myself. Then came the shift, subtle at first. I was no longer being included in everything. Small pieces of information were withheld, justified as not relevant yet. That phrase stuck with me. I didn't challenge it directly. Instead, I started observing more aggressively, trying to reconstruct what I wasn't being told. That's when I realized how dependent I'd become on him for clarity. There was a moment where I asked a direct question and got a non-answer so polished it felt rehearsed. That's when I understood something had changed in the dynamic. I left that meeting with a sinking feeling that I wasn't part of a shared plan anymore. I was part of something that could now move without me. The phrase, secret compromising material, stopped sounding abstract around this time. It became something with weight, something people could actually use, not just talk about. I realized I wasn't only involved in an operation anymore. I was also holding pieces of it. Pieces that, if viewed in isolation, could be interpreted in ways that didn't favor anyone involved, especially me. That's when the tone shifted again. Conversations became more careful. Not openly threatening, but layered with implication. A reminder here, a comment there. The kind of communication where nothing is said directly, but everything is understood. I started thinking less about what I was doing and more about what could be done to me if things went wrong. That change is hard to explain unless you've felt it, the moment when information stops being power and becomes risk. I tried to reassure myself that everyone in this situation was equally exposed. that it balanced out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't how it actually worked. Someone always ends up holding more than they should. Things didn't collapse. They loosened. That's the best way I can describe it. Not a dramatic failure, not alarms or confrontation, just a gradual sense that the structure I had been part of wasn't holding together the way it used to. Messages took longer to be answered. Meetings became optional instead of expected. Names stopped being mentioned as often. It felt like being slowly moved out of a room while everyone pretended I was still sitting in it. I tried to compensate by staying useful, offering help before it was requested, filling gaps, anticipating needs. It was a reflex at that point. If I stayed valuable, I stayed included. But even that started to feel like shouting into a space that was already emptying. There was one moment I can't forget. I asked a simple question about next steps and got a response that didn't actually address anything. Just polite closure. No continuation. That's when it clicked that I wasn't being managed anymore. I was being allowed to drift. After that realization, I started noticing how loud silence can actually be. Not literal silence, but the absence of response, direction, and structure I had grown used to. I kept checking in anyway. Not because I believed I'd get answers, but because I couldn't immediately accept that I wouldn't. It's strange how long a habit survives even when it stops making sense. There were days where I felt almost relieved. No instructions meant no immediate risk, no pressure to act, no constant calculation of consequences. But that relief never lasted long. It always got replaced by something heavier, uncertainty without boundaries. I also began to understand something uncomfortable. I had been useful only as long as I was integrated. Once that utility faded, so did the connection. I thought I would feel anger or betrayal. Instead, it was closer to emptiness. Like being removed from a system that never acknowledged you as permanent in the first place. And in that emptiness, I started to see just how far I had drifted from the version of myself I used to think I was protecting. I didn't get arrested. There was no dramatic fallout, no headline moment where everything collapsed at once. That almost makes it harder to explain, because people expect stories like this to end in something visible. Instead, it ended in distance. From the people involved, from the situation itself, and eventually from the version of me that thought he was just observing at the start. The separation wasn't clean, it was messy, delayed, and mostly internal. I spent a long time trying to rationalize it. Telling myself I got out before things got worse. That I understood the risks. That I had learned something useful. But the truth is simpler and less comfortable. I crossed lines I didn't fully acknowledge while crossing them. And by the time I wanted to step back, I was already carrying consequences that didn't disappear just because the situation did. Now I think differently about control. Not as something you have, but something you keep losing in small, acceptable increments while convincing yourself it's still intact. If there's anything I'd say to someone in a similar position, it's this: the most dangerous part isn't the moment you act. It's all the moments you tell yourself you haven't yet.